Cody, and this is Time for History. In the last video, I talked about why it's important that we study history. In this video, I want to make an argument against studying history. And to do that, we're going to be looking at the 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes. This is what Descartes had to say. He says, "I believed I had already given enough time to languages and also to the reading of classical text, both to their histories and to their fables, for conversing with those of other ages is about the same as traveling. It is good to know something of the customs of various people, so as to judge our own more soundly, and so as not to think that everything that is contrary to our ways is ridiculous and against reason, as those who have seen nothing have a habit of doing. But when one takes too much time traveling, one eventually becomes a stranger in one's own country, and when one is too curious about what commonly took place in past ages, one usually remains quite ignorant of what is taking place in one's own country. Moreover, fables make one imagine many events to be possible which are not so at all. And even the most accurate histories, if they neither alter nor exaggerate the significance of things in order to render them more worthy of being read, almost always at least omit the baser and less noteworthy details. Consequently, the rest do not appear as they really are. And those who govern their own conduct by means of examples drawn from these texts are liable to fall into extravagances of the nights of our romances and to conceive plans that are beyond their powers." Now, I want to be clear that I disagree with Descartes. Studying history is what I do, but I think it's always important that when someone makes a reasoned, evidence-based argument, that we pay attention to it. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying we should give every argument someone makes the time of day. If someone makes a bad faith argument, if they're trying to hurt us, if they're trying to be hurtful, if they're trying to be manipulative, if they're just trying to sell us something, if they don't have adequate evidence, or if they're using misinformation, we certainly shouldn't give them the time of day and pay attention to their bad arguments. But if someone makes a well-reasoned argument, we should certainly pay attention and listen, even if it's something we don't necessarily agree with. So in this argument, Descartes is making 4 points. First of all, he's making the argument, number one, that history is a way of escaping the problems of real life. Number two, he is saying that what historians write is not accurate history, but fantasy or fiction. Number three, he's saying it is impossible to write accurate history. And number four, he's making the argument that history cannot teach us lessons about our real lives and about real life situations. So let's address these point by point. Number one, he argues that history is a way of escaping the problems of real life. Now, he starts out supportive. He compares studying history to traveling. He says you go around and you travel the world, and as you do that, you see how other people live. You see their cultures. You get to know how they live. And that's a good thing, because if you don't do that, then you're going to hear about how they live, and the only thing you know is about how you live. So you hear about how they live, you hear about their culture, and you suddenly think they're dumb, that they're ignorant because they're not like you. But traveling can actually open your eyes to how other people live, and it can give you ideas about how your own life, how your own culture, how your own society, how your own government can actually be better. And that's a good thing. And that's good for traveling, but also by studying history. You can do the same thing, and you can travel through the past by reading books about the past and see how they lived. And that can give you ideas for your own time. But then he turns against it. And he says, now, too much traveling can be a bad thing. It can make it to where you are a stranger in your own land. Your brain is off somewhere in some other culture. You love those other cultures so much that you no longer fit in your own culture. You no longer connect with the people in your own community. So you cannot make your own community better because your brain is off in some other culture. And he makes the same comparison about studying history too much. You escape the problems of modern life. You go back into the past, into some previous time period, and basically you live there vicariously through these books. and you become a stranger in your own time. And he says that's a problem. His second argument is that history is not like real life. Historians want to sell books, and real life is boring. So what he says historians do is they exaggerate the high points and they ignore the low points to make their books more exciting so that more people will read them. And what they end up doing is not writing fact, but fantasy. Not nonfiction, but fiction. And that's a problem. Number 3, he says that even if the historian doesn't do this, it's impossible to actually capture the details of history. Think about the Civil War. This is my example, not his. The Civil War lasted for 4 years. So if a historian wanted to include every fact about the Civil War, that book would take 4 years to read, because the war lasted 4 years if we included all the facts that last 4 years. And that's just from one person's perspective. There were millions of people in the Civil War. So if we look at the entire Civil War from the perspective of each person involved, assuming we could do that, that book would take 4 million years to read. And that's just not going to happen. So instead what happens is the historian must make judgments. He must decide what to include and what to leave out. And this means that what history is not an accurate representation of everything that happened, but a representation of the points that the historian wants to include, a model of what actually happened. Now, the fourth point that Descartes makes is that history cannot teach us lessons about how to live. First, if history is not accurate, if it's just what the historian wanted to include, then that's not a viable model for how to live our own lives because it's based on fantasy. But even if it were accurate, that is still problematic, because even if it is accurate, what's to say that a strategy used during the Civil War is going to work in a military battle today? What is to say that a political strategy for solving a problem that worked 1,000 years ago is going to work today? Just because something worked at one time in the past doesn't mean it's going to work now. So that means that history cannot really solve our problems, even if the first 3 aren't true. So when we read history, he says basically all we're doing is living in a fantasy world, escaping reality. So what do we do with these first points? Just speaking for myself, I don't really buy into the first one. I think the first point is problematic because when we travel, when we go into the past, I don't see it as escapism. Even if we are doing it to escape our modern troubles, we're still going to learn, we're still going to gain knowledge, and we're going to bring that knowledge back with us. It's going to expand our imagination. It's going to give us new ways of solving problems. It's going to help us get into the minds of other people and see how other people think. Even fiction is going to do that. So I think there's value in traveling, and I think there's value in going through history by reading books about history. So I don't really buy into his first argument. Now, the second, third, and fourth argument, he's giving very valid arguments. And during the time when he lived, there were historians who read what he wrote and took it to heart. And they said, wow, he is making valid points. And they tried to do better. They worked over the past 400 years to change their methodologies. Some historians even tried to make history into a science in order to fix the problems that Descartes brought up. So were they successful? Did it work? What have they done, and how effective has history been at fixing these problems? That's what I'm going to include in the upcoming videos. In the next 10 to 15 videos, what we're going to do is we are going to look at how historians from the time of Descartes to the present have addressed these problems and other problems. How have historians addressed the problem of, is history worth studying? What is history? What do we hope to get out of history? All of these kind of questions. So I hope you'll join me as we look at these historians trying to do this. So like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. I'm Cody. This is Time for History. I'll see you then.